On a rainy day, Gwen, a 6 months pregnant Uber driver, unexpectedly saves a man lying unconscious in the middle of the road. She has no idea that he is actually the young CEO of a major corporation. As a gesture of gratitude, she's invited to work a light administrative job at his mansion. But then a photograph she accidentally discovers reveals a shocking secret: the true identity of the baby growing inside her. Before the story continues, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you can catch the next part of this story. Under the heavy clouds of a late Friday afternoon, the city of Fairford moved at its usual pace, slow, strained, and barely aware of the people grinding quietly within its concrete arteries. Somewhere near the edge of a working-class neighborhood, Gwen Stone pulled her old hatchback into a small gravel driveway and cut the engine. The rain had not started yet, but the air smelled heavy, like it was just waiting for the right moment to break loose. Her hands lingered on the steering wheel for a few seconds longer than needed, her back aching slightly from the shift she had just completed. She was 6 months pregnant, and every hour behind the wheel pressed harder against her body. But stopping was not an option. Inside her modest apartment, the lights were dim. The linoleum floor cracked near the threshold, and the small kitchen carried the scent of reheated beans. Dilys, her aunt, and the only family she had left in the state, sat at the table peeling boiled eggs with a speed that revealed both age and efficiency. She looked up as Gwen stepped in, her brows knitting into a familiar expression of disappointment coated in concern. "You shouldn't be out that long," Dilys said, placing the egg down with more force than necessary. "Your ankles are already swollen. What happens when you pass out behind the wheel?" Gwen didn't respond right away. She toed off her shoes, rubbing the ball of one foot against the back of the other, trying to relieve the tingling pressure. Her coat was damp at the cuffs. She moved toward the kitchen slowly, her hand instinctively brushing across her belly. "I'm fine, Auntie," she said, soft but not apologetic. "I only had 2 more rides left. I needed that money." Dilys scoffed quietly, turning away as she opened the fridge, which hummed louder than the usual quiet between them. She pulled out a half-empty carton of milk, shook it, and muttered something inaudible. Gwen sat down, leaned back slightly, and allowed herself to rest for a minute. She could feel her baby kicking nothing too strong, just enough to remind her he was there and that she wasn't alone. But that didn't make the bills go away, nor did it make the rent notice she had hidden behind the microwave any less threatening. Dilys turned around this time, her tone sharper. "You know that car is not going to save you from this world. Not when it's raining. Not when you're showing this much." Gwen didn't look at her. She focused on the ring left by a coffee mug on the table, one that had stained through the wood like a permanent memory. "The car is all I've got right now. That and my kid." There was a pause. The fridge clicked off. The room fell into a silence that stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Gwen stood up slowly, winced a little from the back pain, and grabbed her keys again. She was still in her uniform dark blue polo black slacks, her name badge long since cracked in one corner. "I got 1 more trip," she said. "Then I'll be home. I promise." Dilys didn't stop her, didn't raise her voice, but the sigh that escaped her chest as the door closed behind Gwen was heavy enough to carry down the stairwell. As Gwen drove through the early evening streets, the sky deepened into gray. Drops began to fall slow and spaced, then faster until they turned into sheets. Her windshield wipers dragged across the glass with rhythmic protests, doing their best to keep up. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Another ride request. The destination wasn't far, only a 15-minute trip, but the name was unfamiliar, and the map took her toward the outer business district, where office buildings sat like sleeping giants. Across town, the celebration at the Langston Grand Hotel was still in full swing. The ballroom gleamed under gold lighting, and crystal glasses chimed every few seconds. Galvin Matthews stood near the center of the room, dressed in a dark tailored suit, shaking hands with board members and executives twice his age. His new title, Chief Executive Officer of Matthews Corporation, had just been announced. Everyone said it was a historic moment, youngest in the company's history, a new chapter, a brighter future. Galvin smiled where he needed to, nodded politely, but his eyes were distant. His mother, Adelia Matthews, stood just a few feet behind him, always watching. Her presence was polished, exact, and cold, in the way only old money could afford to be. "Galvin," she said when he stepped aside for a brief moment to refill his drink, "you need to make a stronger impression. This is not a college mixer. These are your investors. I've spoken to each of them, he replied calmly, his voice neutral. You spoke like a man with options, she said. You don't have any. Not anymore. Galvin didn't argue. He finished his drink and placed the glass on the tray of a passing waiter. Then, without a word, he stepped out of the ballroom and made his way through the hotel's side entrance, declining the offer of a driver. His usual driver had been sent home early due to a family emergency. Galvin insisted he could handle the short drive back to his penthouse. By the time he reached the car, the rain had turned into a downpour. He adjusted the collar of his coat and slid behind the wheel, the leather seat groaning slightly beneath him. As he started the engine, he exhaled and rested his forehead against the steering wheel for a moment. Just a moment. That was all he needed. The tension in his temples had been building since early morning. A dull ache now pulsed steadily above his eyes. He drove slowly, cautiously. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The city lights blurred in the rain smeared across his windshield like oil. The ache in his head sharpened. His vision tunneled slightly. He blinked hard once-twice. He pulled over to the side of the road and left the engine running. For a moment, he leaned back in the seat, his breath shallow, the air around him feeling dense and stale. The world inside the car seemed to close in. Without fully thinking, he opened the driver's side door and stepped out, the cold rain instantly hitting his face like a slap. His shoes landed on wet pavement. He reached for the doorframe to steady himself, hoping a few gulps of fresh air would be enough to shake the dizziness. But the ground beneath him felt unstable. His chest tightened. He took one step staggered and then dropped first to his knees, then fully onto his side, collapsing onto the roadside curb with his body soaked instantly. The headlights from his car remained on, casting a long beam through the rain, illuminating his motionless frame as the water rushed past him. Elsewhere, Gwen was just a few blocks away. Her final passenger dropped off near a convenience store. She checked the app. No more requests. Time to head home. She turned onto the narrow road near the edge of the business district. The streets were nearly empty now. The rain distorted every reflection. Her headlights carved a path forward, and then she saw it. Something or someone was lying near the shoulder. She squinted, heart rate rising. God, she whispered. She hit the brakes. The tires slid briefly before gripping. Her car halted just feet away from the still figure. The rain bounced off her windshield like static. Without thinking, Gwen opened the door and ran out. The water soaked through her clothes instantly. Her shoes slipped slightly on the pavement as she knelt beside the body. A man, drenched unconscious, wearing a suit. His hair was plastered to his forehead. She reached for his wrist, her fingers shaking, and found a pulse faint. But there. "Sir," she said, tapping his cheek gently. "Can you hear me?" No response. Her phone was back in the car. She rushed to get it, dialing emergency services as fast as her wet fingers would allow. She returned to his side, speaking through the phone as the operator asked questions. Yes, he's breathing. I think he passed out. He's wearing a suit. He might be someone important. As the sirens began to howl faintly in the distance, Gwen looked at him again. Really looked. His face was pale under the street lamp. His lips parted slightly as though trying to speak. She adjusted his coat to shield him from the rain. In her mind, she wasn't thinking about his title or what kind of man he was. She was thinking about how alone he looked, how helpless, and maybe in some strange way how familiar that felt. The smell of antiseptic hit Gwen the second the ambulance doors opened. The gurney carrying the unconscious man was wheeled ahead without pause, swallowed instantly by the automatic double doors of the emergency wing. The paramedics didn't even glance at her again. She followed behind, slow and careful, one hand pressed gently against her lower belly. The fluorescent lights inside the hospital stung her eyes after the dimness of the rain-soaked street. Her coat clung to her body, drenched and heavy. A nurse with a tablet glanced up at her but didn't say a word. Instead, she typed something and turned away. At the check-in counter, Gwen gave her name, explained she had found a man on the side of the road unconscious. She tried to be as clear as possible. The clerk, a young woman with clipped blonde hair and tired eyes, barely looked up. "So you're not family?" "No, I found him. He passed out in the rain." The clerk nodded, uninterested. "Take a seat over there. We'll let you know if we need anything." She didn't ask if Gwen was okay, didn't offer a towel or blanket. The waiting area felt like a refrigerated box. Gwen sat down stiffly, dripping onto the plastic chair, arms wrapped around herself. Her stomach ached more from tension than pain now, but still enough to remind her to breathe slowly. Time moved strangely in that place. Minutes bled into each other. Occasionally a nurse or orderly passed by, glancing at her, some with curiosity, others with something colder. She heard whispers, low voices from the nurse's station. "Is she with him?" one voice asked. "Doubt it," another said. "She doesn't look like she belongs with someone like that." Gwen caught their eyes. They didn't even bother hiding it. She wanted to speak up to say something, but she'd had enough nights like this in her life to know when it was safer to stay quiet. A young doctor approached her after nearly 30 minutes. His scrubs were wrinkled eyes lined with exhaustion, but his expression was kinder than the rest. "Miss Gwen Stone." She nodded and stood slowly. "I'm Dr. Smith. You mentioned some abdominal pain. We'd like to do a quick checkup just to be safe." He led her to a smaller examination room, gave her a dry hospital gown and privacy to change. When he returned, his tone stayed neutral but professional. "You're 6 months along." "Yes, still working nights." She nodded. He sighed gently, pressing the cold ultrasound probe to her belly. "That's a lot on your body. Any contractions or bleeding?" "No, just tightness. Probably stress." The image of the baby appeared on the monitor, healthy and moving. Dr. Smith softened. "Good news. Baby's doing okay. But you, Miss Stone, you need to slow down. You're pushing too hard." She offered a tired smile. Not much of a choice. Back in the waiting room, she changed back into her damp clothes. No one had come to speak with her. No one had said thank you. The man she had found, the man she'd helped, had vanished behind walls and doors meant only for people with insurance or family or power. A tall woman in a sleek suit arrived just after dawn. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile. Her presence cut through the sleepy quiet of the hospital. She went straight to the front desk, showed a badge, and spoke in hushed tones. Gwen noticed her immediately, the posture, the precision. She wasn't just someone from his office. She was the type who handled the messes for men like him. Victoria Cruz. That was the name the nurse mentioned when she walked past Gwen without a glance. 10 minutes later, Victoria emerged from the hallway. Her eyes found Gwen, quickly narrowing slightly. "You're Miss Stone." Gwen stood wary. "Yes, I'm Victoria Cruz, Mr. Matthews' executive assistant. I understand you were the one who found him last night." Gwen nodded but said nothing else. Her voice didn't feel welcome. "Thank you," Victoria added stiffly. Then she extended an envelope. "This is a gesture of appreciation from Mr. Matthews." Gwen's heart sank. "Money." "Of course." She raised her hand and shook her head. "I don't want anything. I just called for help." Victoria didn't move. "It's not charity. He simply wishes to express gratitude." "I didn't do it for gratitude." Their eyes locked. Victoria's gaze was unreadable, but the silence held weight. Finally, Gwen took the envelope not for herself, but because arguing any longer would make no difference. Victoria handed her a card as well. "If you need anything, just call. We'll make arrangements." Gwen looked down at the card. It was thick, cream-colored, embossed with silver ink. It didn't look like something meant for someone like her. A nurse approached, quietly clearing her throat. "Miss Stone, we're ready to discharge you. But before you go, someone left this for you." She handed over a simple piece of paper, a note written in neat handwriting. "Thank you, GM. No more, no less." Gwen stared at the initials for a long time, her mind replaying the moment she saw him on the road. The rain, the way he looked so human, vulnerable. She left the hospital with no umbrella, no change of clothes, and no certainty about what had just happened. The streets were still damp morning light beginning to stretch across the sky. Her car was right where she left it, cold and quiet. As she sat inside and started the engine, her reflection in the mirror caught her by surprise. She looked older, worn, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. A question, one she couldn't quite answer. Who was that man? And why did something about him feel unfinished? The morning after her unexpected night at the hospital, Gwen stood in front of the mirror in her small room, still trying to process everything that had happened. Her reflection looked tired, pale, and older than she remembered. There was a heaviness behind her eyes, the kind that didn't come from sleeplessness alone. Her hand drifted down to her rounded belly, and for a long moment she simply stood there, silent, listening to her own breathing. She had saved a stranger's life, a man she hadn't known, didn't recognize, yet something about the encounter lingered in her. The look of him lying on the road, the storm, the urgency, the way those men in suits had swarmed in and taken over. It felt like a dream, but the soreness in her legs and the hospital bracelet she still hadn't cut off told her it was all real. Outside the streets of East Briarwood were already bustling. Her neighborhood was rough around the edges. Rows of cramped duplexes, chain-link fences, corner stores with bulletproof glass. She adjusted her hoodie, careful to cover her belly as much as possible, and headed toward the bus stop. Her rideshare car was still parked at the hospital. She couldn't afford to retrieve it just yet, not until she sorted out her shift schedule. The wind was cold biting. She kept her head low. Meanwhile, Galvin Matthews sat upright in a private hospital suite surrounded by silence. The room was too clean, too white, and too expensive to feel human. The city skyline gleamed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and every beep from the medical monitor beside him sounded like a reminder that he hadn't died. He didn't remember much from the night before, only flashes, rain, a blinding headache, a woman's voice, then blackout. He glanced at the fresh bouquet of orchids on the table, a note from the board congratulating him on his formal installment as CEO. He should have felt triumphant, but instead he felt unsettled. "Victoria," he said as his assistant entered the room with a clipboard in hand. "The woman who called the ambulance. Do we have a name?" Victoria paused, looked up from her papers, and hesitated. "She's listed as Gwen Stone. That's all the paramedics had. No contact information, but we could probably find her if we look through the hospital intake records." "I want to find her," Galvin said, his tone flat but firm. Quietly, back in Gwen's world, things were anything but quiet. She had just arrived at her part-time job at the corner grocer, a place she only returned to because her body wouldn't yet allow for longer shifts behind the wheel. The manager, Mr. Halpern, was leaning on the counter reading a tabloid. He barely glanced at her as she walked in, his tone dry. "You look like you had a rough night. Don't bring drama into my store." "I won't," Gwen said quietly. "Just here to finish my shift." But drama, it seemed, had followed her anyway. A customer, a woman in a tailored coat with a Louis Vuitton purse and well-done nails, eyed Gwen carefully as she bagged her items. "You're the girl from the hospital, right? The one they said helped Galvin Matthews." Her voice was laced with a condescending surprise. Gwen didn't answer. "He's a Matthews," the woman said again. "That family doesn't associate with—" "Well, never mind." Gwen kept her eyes down, fingers tightening around the plastic handle of the bag. She handed the groceries over with a forced smile. "Have a nice day, ma'am." Once the woman left, Mr. Halpern approached. "Is that true? You were on the news?" "I didn't do anything special," Gwen muttered. He grunted. "Well, just make sure people don't think this is that kind of place." That kind of place. Gwen didn't need him to elaborate. Her chest felt tight. She pressed a hand to her belly and swallowed the bitterness. Later that evening, Gwen sat in the small kitchen she shared with Aunt Dillis. The room was warm but cluttered, filled with the smell of fried plantains and onions. Dillis, a woman of few words and strong convictions, placed a plate in front of her. "Eat while it's hot." Thanks, Auntie." Dillis sat across from her, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You don't look all right. What's going on?" Gwen shrugged. "Just tired. You went to the hospital yesterday. Then today, you went right back to work. You're not made of stone, Gwen." "I have to keep working. They won't hold my spot forever. I need the money." Dillis studied her, then softened. "You've always been strong, but even strong people need rest." The quiet in the kitchen felt sacred for a moment. Then Gwen added almost hesitantly, "The man I helped, they said he's some big-shot CEO. There were men in suits. Security. I didn't even get to talk to him." Dillis raised an eyebrow. "Did he say thank you?" "No, not yet." Dillis leaned back. "Then maybe he ain't worth remembering." But Gwen did remember, and what she remembered most was the sound of his breathing, returning the warmth of his skin despite the rain, and the fear in her heart when she thought he might die. Elsewhere in the stillness of his penthouse, Galvin sat at his desk flipping through the security report Victoria had compiled. On the screen was a still image pulled from a hospital hallway camera, a blurry frame of Gwen standing under the emergency lights soaked in rain, her arms folded tightly across her body. "That's her," he said. Victoria nodded. "We can trace her license plate from the hospital entrance logs, but it might take some time." "Do it," Galvin said, his eyes never leaving the screen. That night, while Gwen sipped tea and tried to quiet the restlessness inside her, the local news channel aired a feature on Galvin Matthews. Footage rolled of him shaking hands with investors, smiling under camera lights, stepping into a town car. Gwen watched from the edge of her seat, her spoon frozen in midair. "That's him," she whispered. Dillis looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Who?" "The man I found. That's him." Dillis glanced at the screen. "Galvin Matthews. I've heard of him. One of those families." Gwen didn't say anything else. Her eyes lingered on the screen long after the story had changed. Something inside her stirred. Not hope, not fantasy, just a question. Why do I keep thinking about him? At the same time, Galvin stood on his rooftop balcony, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. The city below looked beautiful but far away. He exhaled slowly, then turned to Victoria, who had followed him up. "She saved my life," he said. "I know, and yet if I hadn't seen that footage, I might have forgotten her face entirely. That doesn't sit right with me." Victoria waited. "I want to thank her. Not through some envelope of money or corporate gift. I want to do it in person." Victoria didn't argue. She simply nodded. "I'll arrange it." In 2 different homes, 2 different lives paused, thinking about the same night, the same connection, and wondering where it might lead. That was how the distance between them began to shrink, not by fate or magic, but by choice. Quiet, deliberate human choice. And the storm that brought them together was only the beginning. The invitation came on a Wednesday, just 2 days after Gwen had seen Galvin's face flash across the television screen. Victoria called her directly, the tone of her voice even but firm, almost rehearsed. She said Galvin had insisted on finding a more sincere way to thank Gwen than envelopes and silent notes. He wanted to offer her a position light administrative work part-time with housing included. Gwen was caught off guard. The words sounded too neat, too generous, and too sudden. But when Victoria added that the work could be done sitting down and the hours were hers to choose, something in Gwen's chest tightened. After a long pause, she asked if she could think about it overnight. Victoria agreed. That night, Gwen lay awake for hours. She tried to picture herself walking through hallways that echoed, sitting in rooms filled with polished furniture and cold air. She imagined what her aunt would say, what her neighbors might think. But more than that, she thought about the weight in her belly, the rent notices piling behind the fruit bowl, and the fact that the only thing Galvin Matthews had asked of her, without ever saying it aloud, was to let him help in a way he could control. By morning, her decision was made. She called Victoria back and said yes. On Friday morning, a black sedan picked her up outside her building. The driver wore gloves. He didn't say much. The ride was smooth, long, and quiet. As they crossed into the historic district where the Matthews estate stood, Gwen's breath shortened. The gate opened soundlessly. The house was not just large, it was intimidating. The kind of place where footsteps got lost in marble. The driver led her to the side entrance where Victoria met her with a folder and a neutral expression. Gwen was briefed quickly, shown her room, and introduced to the systems she'd be managing: files, calendar appointments, printed correspondence. It was manageable. It was safe. The first 2 days passed without incident. Staff members nodded politely, but didn't engage. Gwen kept to herself, doing what was asked and taking breaks in her room or the side garden. She saw Galvin once from a distance as he walked across the courtyard on a phone call, and once when he nodded to her through an office window. He hadn't spoken to her directly yet, and she wasn't sure if she was relieved or disappointed. She kept reminding herself this was just work, nothing more. On Sunday evening, Victoria informed her that Mrs. Adelia Matthews would be returning from her business trip on Friday morning. Gwen nodded, not quite understanding the weight of that information. By the time Friday arrived, she understood. The house was quieter than usual that morning. Staff moved briskly, more tightly wound. Uniforms were neater. Silverware placement was double-checked. Gwen sensed the shift but said nothing. Around 9, the sound of an engine rolled up the driveway. Through the window, Gwen saw a sleek car glide to a stop. The door opened, and a tall woman stepped out. Adelia Matthews was elegance, sharpened to a point, her posture perfect, her face unreadable, her coat flawless. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never had to ask permission to exist. Gwen was in the main hall organizing courier envelopes when the front doors opened. The energy changed immediately. Conversations halted. Shoes stopped mid-stride. Gwen looked up instinctively, placing a hand on her belly. Adelia entered, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor. She greeted no one. Her gaze swept the room. When it landed on Gwen, it stayed. There was no drama in the silence that followed. No gasp, no raised voice. Just 2 women, one rich and powerful, the other poor and pregnant, locked in a moment where class, color, and expectation collided without a sound. Adelia turned to Victoria, who had appeared beside her. Her voice was cool. "Who is that?" Victoria didn't stammer. "Gwen Stone, the woman who found Mr. Matthews the night he collapsed. She's assisting with administrative work while recovering." Adelia's eyes never left Gwen. "Assisting?" she repeated, then more slowly, "in this house." Victoria nodded. At Galvin's request, Adelia tilted her head slightly. "I see." She walked forward, each step deliberate. She stopped directly in front of Gwen, eyes drifting for a moment to Gwen's midsection. Her lips curled almost imperceptibly. "You're pregnant." Gwen stood still. "Yes, ma'am." "I assumed this was a residence, not a shelter." The sentence hung there, sharp and calculated. Gwen didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. "I'm here to work." "So I was told." Adelia said, her smile polite and lifeless. "We typically hire professionals with more formal experience." Victoria tried to interject. "She's been efficient, thorough. Galvin—" Adelia raised a hand slightly. The conversation stopped. She turned back to Gwen. "I trust you'll know your place here." Gwen nodded, once jaw clenched. Adelia walked away. The air did not settle after she left. It thickened. Gwen returned to her tasks, but her hands shook slightly. She could feel the stares of the staff. Not hateful, not mocking, just silent and complicit. No one would speak to her of what had just happened, but they had all seen it, and that was enough. Later that day, Gwen sat alone in her small room folding laundry with mechanical precision. Her back hurt. The baby shifted, and she whispered softly to her belly, a habit she had developed when stress overtook her. "We're okay. We're still okay." Down the hall, Galvin returned from a board meeting to find Victoria waiting in his study. She met your mother." He sat down, removed his tie. "How did it go?" Victoria hesitated. "About as well as you'd expect." Galvin closed his eyes briefly. "Did Gwen say anything?" "She didn't have to." He nodded slowly, then stood again. "I'll talk to my mother." Victoria didn't answer. She knew he wouldn't. Not yet. He wasn't ready. That evening, Gwen walked the side garden alone. The moon was low, the air cool. She felt out of place, not because she didn't belong, but because the house wouldn't let her belong. Her value here was conditional, her presence tolerated. She wasn't angry, not yet, but the seed was planted. Somewhere inside the house, Galvin stared out a window, watching her silhouette in the garden, hands cradling her belly. He didn't move. Neither of them did. Not yet. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Gwen stood by the large filing cabinet in the east wing, methodically organizing years of dormant company records that no one had touched in ages. The Matthews estate had a way of making even silence feel heavy. Outside, the trees barely moved, and inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a low hum. Her hands were tired, the baby shifting low in her belly, but her mind needed the distraction. It had been almost a week since Mrs. Adelia Matthews returned, and while no more words had been exchanged, Gwen could feel the quiet tension in every corner of the house. She had learned to walk with softer steps, to speak a little less, to exist without taking up too much space. Her fingers brushed against the edge of a leather-bound folder hidden between stacks of outdated finance reports. Curiosity took over, and she slid it out carefully, brushing off the dust. Inside, a collection of photos fell into her hand, event photographs from what appeared to be a corporate masquerade gala. Faces half covered by ornate masks, gowns shimmering under chandeliers, champagne flutes raised mid-laugh. She smiled faintly at the extravagance until one photo made her breath hitch. It wasn't the whole face that stopped her. It was the eyes, cold blue, sharp, unmistakably him. The man in the photo wore a silver mask that covered the upper half of his face, but Gwen would have recognized that gaze anywhere. She stared harder, tracing the line of his jaw, the subtle scar near his cheekbone. Her hand trembled as she turned the photo over, but there was no name, just a date 8 months ago. Her heart thudded unevenly, and she dropped to sit on the edge of a low storage bench. Her mind wasn't just racing, it was unraveling. She had seen those eyes before that night. She found him on the road. Not just on television, not just behind the boardroom glass, but up close, intimately close. That night at the gala, she had been there. She wasn't a guest. She had been part of the catering staff, dressed in black, moving silently through crowds of wealth and ambition. And she remembered that moment now, as if her body had stored it all this time, waiting for the right image to trigger the flood. She had been pushed into a corner by a drunk guest who thought her silence meant permission. His grip on her wrist had been tight, his breath soaked in whiskey. Her no had gone unheard until another hand reached in and pulled her away. The voice came low and even. "She's with me." That had been it. No argument, no scene, just control, quiet and clear. The man had stepped between them, placed his hand lightly on her back, and guided her into a hallway near the back of the venue. She had barely looked up, only felt the relief in her chest and the cold sweat on her palms. He had offered her a bottle of water, asked if she was all right. She had nodded, swallowing the tightness in her throat. She remembered sitting beside him on a low bench outside the ballroom, both of them silent for a long while. Then the conversation had started slowly, naturally. They didn't exchange names. It was part of the fun, maybe part of the fear. He had told her he was tired of people talking to him like he was a logo, a surname. She had told him she wanted to move far away from the noise. They had laughed. He had offered her a drink from a flask that he promised was smoother than the wine being passed around. She had taken it, just a sip, then another. She didn't remember exactly how they ended up alone in one of the guest rooms behind a locked door, but she remembered the way he looked at her, not like someone taking, but like someone asking. They had been drunk, both of them, but not unconscious, not confused. It had been fast, clumsy, and quiet. When she woke in the morning, the room was still dim and he was asleep. She hadn't waited. She had slipped out, taken the early subway home, and cried in the shower for reasons she couldn't name. A few weeks later, when the test came back positive, she had stared at the bathroom mirror for a long time. She had gone over every possibility, every person, every moment. But deep down, she had always known, even when she convinced herself otherwise, even when she told herself she didn't care. Now the truth was staring back at her from a photo she wasn't meant to find. Galvin Matthews was the man in the silver mask, the father of her child. Gwen sat frozen for a long time, the photo still in her hand. Her vision blurred, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Her fingers curled around the image, her breath uneven. It was as if the room had shifted, the foundation cracked. She thought of all the times she had stood in the same hallway as him these past weeks, the passing nods, the small glances. Had he recognized her? Did he remember? Or was she just another blurred night in a privileged life full of indulgent evenings? She tried to stand, but sat back down quickly, the weight in her abdomen making the motion difficult. She placed a hand over her belly. The baby kicked. Gwen whispered to it with a voice full of conflict. "You're his." The words hung in the still air. They didn't sound bitter. They didn't sound joyful, just true. Later that evening, after placing the photo back in the file and returning it where she found it, Gwen went to her room and locked the door. She didn't eat. She didn't answer messages from Dillis. She lay on her side, watching shadows move across the ceiling. Every few minutes, she blinked harder than usual, holding back tears that threatened to break. She thought about confronting him. She thought about packing and leaving. She thought about the baby's future. She remembered how careful his hands had been that night, how he hadn't pushed, hadn't presumed, how there had been silence, not words, and how she hadn't needed to say anything more. But she also remembered that he had never asked who she was, never tried to find her. And that hurt more than she expected. In another wing of the house, Galvin stood looking at a presentation board, speaking in measured tones to Victoria about a potential merger. His voice was even focused, but for a moment he paused, turned slightly, as if he had felt something off. Victoria noticed. "You all right?" He shook his head lightly. "Just a strange feeling." She moved on, but Galvin lingered the words Gwen had spoken at the hospital, echoing back in fragments he didn't understand yet. Down the hall, Gwen finally allowed herself a single sob before whispering again to no one in particular. "What do I do now?" And the silence didn't answer. It began quietly, the way most breaking points do. Gwen was in the small sitting room adjacent to the library, sorting through archival files Victoria had left her with earlier that morning. The hours passed slowly. Her mind hadn't settled since the discovery of the photo, the memory she had buried, now living loudly in her chest. She hadn't spoken to Galvin since. She hadn't decided if she ever would. But the unease that had taken root in her was growing. She felt watched. By noon, Victoria came to her door, tapping gently. "Mrs. Matthews would like a word. In the sunroom." Gwen's stomach tightened. It wasn't phrased like a request. Still, she stood, smoothed her dress over her round belly, and followed. The walk felt longer than it was. When she arrived, Adelia was already seated, a teacup untouched before her posture, so composed it felt rehearsed. She didn't rise, didn't offer a greeting. Her eyes tracked Gwen from the moment she stepped into the light. "Sit." Gwen obeyed. The silence stretched as Adelia examined her like a puzzle with too many wrong edges. Finally, she spoke. "I have always prided myself on understanding people, on reading between the lines. The quiet ones are the ones you must watch closely. They hide their ambition in humility." Gwen said nothing. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Adelia continued, "It didn't take long. I had your records pulled. Nothing illegal, of course, public information. And it painted a picture. A young woman, poor, from a troubled family, temporary jobs, floating. Then suddenly, here, with a baby due in 2 months?" Gwen straightened. "I was invited here." Adelia's voice cooled further. "By a man who didn't know who you were, who still doesn't." The air thinned. "You were at the gala 8 months ago, were you not, the one hosted by Matthews Enterprises? You worked the floor." Her words sharpened. "I saw the attendance list, the service rosters. You were there. Galvin was there. And now you are here." Gwen didn't respond. She didn't flinch, but her hands gripped the arms of her chair. Adelia leaned forward. "I know that child is his." The words hung between them, not as a question, but a verdict. Gwen wanted to speak, to correct, to defend, but nothing formed. The silence was too loud. "You think this house, this name can carry the weight of scandal, of whispers. You think we are insulated from the world." Her tone hardened. "The Matthews family has survived generations on discretion, precision, and discipline. We do not bend. We do not accommodate accidents." Gwen inhaled slowly. "I never asked for your name, or your charity." Adelia studied her, then reached into her purse and placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. The edge of it brushed the porcelain saucer. Gwen didn't touch it. "This is enough to start over. Somewhere far from here. Somewhere no one knows you. I've included relocation arrangements, 6 months of support, and confidentiality terms. All you have to do is leave. Tonight?" Gwen stared at the envelope. Her throat burned. "And if I don't?" Adelia's jaw clenched. "You will not stay in this house. Not with that child. Not under my roof. Galvin is to be engaged within the month. To a woman of his standing. His future is set. I will not allow you to derail it." The pain came fast, not physical, but cold and sharp. Gwen stood slowly, her voice low but steady. "You don't need to threaten me. I never meant to cause harm. But you don't get to erase people just because they don't fit your mold." Adelia said nothing. Gwen looked down at her belly, then back at the woman across from her. "I'll go, but not because you scared me, and not for your money. I'll go because I won't raise my child in a place that looks at him like a blemish." She walked away from the sunroom with her back straight, her legs trembling. When she reached her quarters, she didn't cry. She packed slowly, deliberately. A small bag, essentials only. She wrote a note and left it on Galvin's desk. The words were careful, deceptively simple. "I'm sorry. I can't stay. I've made peace with the past, and I need to move forward. I've reconnected with the child's father. This is what's best. Thank you for everything. Please don't come looking." She signed only her first name. It was a lie, but it was the only truth she could offer that wouldn't destroy him. At dawn, Gwen walked past the gates without ceremony. No driver, no suitcase. Just a coat, a bag, and a heart full of restraint. The air was cool, the sky pale. Her steps were slow but firm. When the bus arrived, she climbed in, took a seat near the back, and didn't look out the window. Her hand rested on her belly the whole ride home. She didn't tell Dillis the truth. Not yet. Not today. She just returned to the small room, to the old quilt, to the scent of fried onions and bleach. She lay down on her side and closed her eyes. She thought of Galvin, of the way he had looked at her without knowing, of the chance he never had to choose. And she whispered into the quiet, "Be okay, please, just be okay." She wasn't sure who she meant, herself, the baby, or the man she had left behind. The ballroom at the Langford Grand shimmered under the weight of crystal chandeliers and rehearsed smiles. Every detail had been orchestrated: the imported flowers, the string quartet in the corner, the champagne chilled precisely to temperature. It was the kind of setting meant to convey prestige, legacy, perfection. And Galvin Matthews stood at the center of it, dressed in a tailored tuxedo that fit like armor, stiff and suffocating. He stared at his reflection in the full-length mirror of the antechamber, smoothing the already perfect lapels of his jacket. The image that stared back at him felt distant, like a stranger playing his part in someone else's script. A knock tapped gently against the door. Victoria stepped in, discreet as ever, holding a small box and an envelope. "This just came from the front desk," she said softly. "A courier from the East Side Clinic." Galvin's eyes narrowed. Clinic Victoria offered a subtle nod, eyes scanning the door behind her before closing it with a quiet click. "Emergency contact. I listed you under employer and guardian after Gwen left." She never removed it. His breath caught. He took the envelope from her fingers. Inside was a single page, clinical in tone, but unmistakable in content. Gwen had gone into labor early. Complications possible. Admitted Sunday morning. No family registered. For a moment he didn't move. His fingers pressed the page too tightly, crinkling its edge. Then he looked at the small box in Victoria's other hand. She left that too, she said. At the house. The day she left. Galvin opened it slowly. Inside was a tiny pair of hand-knitted booties. Yellow. Soft. Clearly handmade. Nestled beneath it was a note in Gwen's handwriting. Please don't blame yourself. I chose to leave. Some roads aren't meant to meet again. But he or she will know who you are. One day. He blinked, stunned by the weight of her words. It didn't feel real. None of it did. But suddenly the suffocating room around him, the champagne toasts waiting the expectation of walking hand in hand with a woman he barely knew. None of it made sense anymore. The door burst open behind him. Adelia swept in radiant in a steel-gray gown. Her diamonds sparkled, her eyes were ice. Galvin, the photographers are in position. Come now, darling. Everyone's waiting. He didn't turn. Gwen's in the hospital. She's giving birth. The room fell silent. Adelia blinked once. That isn't your concern anymore. His voice was low. It's my child. Adelia stepped forward, voice sharp. You don't even know that for sure. And even if it were, there are ways these matters are handled. Quietly. Discreetly. You do not walk out of your engagement party for a mistake. He turned to her eyes, dark and steady. She wasn't a mistake. Adelia's composure cracked for the first time. Her fingers curled at her sides. You would destroy everything for her. He took a step toward the door. I'm not destroying anything. I'm saving something before it disappears forever. Her voice climbed. You'll ruin this family, our reputation. You think the board will overlook you abandoning your engagement for a woman like her, a pregnant girl from nowhere? Galvin's jaw clenched. Say her name. Adelia's mouth tightened. What say? Her name. His voice cut like glass. You know it. You dug up her whole life. Say her name. Adelia looked at him, stricken. For the first time, she seemed unsure of her footing. Gwen. He nodded once. Good. Now you can tell the press why I'm not at the podium. And with that, he turned and walked past her, through the hallway, down the marble stairs. He didn't run, but every step had urgency. Behind him, the music swelled and the chatter began to rise in pitch like a hive agitated. But he didn't stop. Not for anyone. His driver wasn't waiting, so he headed straight to the valet line, peeled $100 from his wallet, and slid into the front seat of a guest's parked town car before the valet could argue. The streets outside blurred under a gray afternoon sky. Rain threatened pooling along the edges of the sidewalks. Galvin drove fast but steady, one hand on the wheel, the other clenched around the booties still in his pocket. Every red light felt like a punishment. His mind cycled through every memory. Her laugh in the study, her careful hands folding linen, the hesitation in her eyes the night before she disappeared. He hadn't believed she would really leave. He hadn't wanted to believe it. 28 minutes later, he screeched into the emergency drive of Eastside General. Inside, the receptionist looked startled by the man in a tuxedo, but Galvin didn't flinch. Gwen Stone, he said. She was admitted this morning. Labor. I need to see her. The nurse tapped at her computer, blinking at the urgency in his voice. She's in delivery room 3, but I can't allow I'm the father. The nurse hesitated. I'll sign whatever you want. I need to be there. A beat passed, then she handed him a paper. He scrawled his name so fast, it was barely legible. She pointed him down the corridor. He ran. Outside the delivery room, he paused. Through the small window, he could see Gwen on the table, sweat dotting her brow. Hair-matted lips pulled in a tight grimace of pain. 2 nurses flanked her. Dr. Smith stood at her side, calm and focused. Galvin pushed the door open. The moment Gwen saw him, her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with a wave of emotion, too complex to name, pain, surprise, anger, and maybe something else. What are you doing here? She whispered through clenched teeth. I couldn't let you do this alone, he said, stepping closer. I know everything. Not all of it, but enough. Tears welled in her eyes, but she turned away as another contraction hit. Dr. Smith barely looked up. If you're staying, grab a glove and hold her hand. We're crowning. Galvin did. And in that room, as Gwen bore down teeth-gritted body, shaking, something shifted. He saw her not as the woman who saved him or the woman who left him, but as the strongest person he had ever known. A sharp cry filled the room. Then silence. Then a gasp. The baby's small red wrinkled was placed gently on Gwen's chest. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Dr. Smith turned to Galvin. "Would you like to cut the cord?" Galvin knotted his throat too tight for words. When it was done, Dr. Smith cleared his throat, glanced at Gwen, then back to Galvin. "The baby has a birthmark. And there's a genetic trait we'll need to run tests, but from what I see, this isn't random. It's inherited, specifically through paternal lineage." Galvin looked at him stunned. Dr. Smith's voice was soft. "This is your child, no doubt. No maybe." Galvin sat in the chair beside Gwen, who was pale eyes, closed fingers wrapped protectively around the baby. He reached forward slowly. She didn't stop him. He rested his palm on the baby's head. "I should have found you sooner," he whispered. Gwen's eyes flicked open. "I didn't want to be found." He nodded. "I know. But I'm here now. And I'm not leaving." The lights buzzed softly above them. Outside the window, the first drops of rain began to fall. But inside, for the first time in weeks, something quiet settled between them. Not peace. Not yet. But maybe the start of it. The waiting room was sterile and humming with soft mechanical rhythms, ventilation monitors, distant footsteps. Galvin stood in front of the glass window, arms crossed tightly across his chest. His jaw clenched and unclenched every few seconds. On the other side of the glass, his son Tiny, swaddled in pale blue, lay under the gentle orange warmth of the neonatal heater. The nurse had dimmed the lights slightly at his request. He didn't want the child waking up too harshly into the world. The world had been harsh enough already. He still hadn't said the word son out loud. It sat in his chest like an unopened letter, obvious, heavy, real, but unread. Behind him, a door clicked open. Dr. Smith walked in with the kind of purpose that told Galvin the time for ambiguity had ended. "We got the preliminary results," he said quietly. Galvin turned slowly, the lines under his eyes deeper than usual, darker. His hair was disheveled from running his hands through it too often. He didn't ask if the test was ready. He had waited in silence, drinking cold hospital coffee for hours, not saying a word to anyone except to ask about Gwen. She was resting, stable, but still silent. He hadn't seen her yet. He didn't know if she wanted to see him. Dr. Smith held a sealed envelope but then shook his head slightly and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. "You don't need this," he said. "It's him, Galvin. We ran a rapid 10-marker STR panel in-house. Not the full kit, but high confidence, 99.9%. Galvin looked back through the glass. The child shifted lips, puckering hands, twitching inside the blanket. "I knew it," he murmured, "but I needed to hear it." Dr. Smith nodded and gave him a moment. The air shifted, not in temperature, not in sound. Something internal. Galvin's shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time in what felt like weeks, his breath left him without tension. Not relief, not exactly, but a kind of gravity had taken hold. He was anchored now. He wasn't floating above the chaos anymore. He was in it, connected, responsible. "Does Gwen know?" he asked, voice quieter. "She's resting. I haven't told her yet." "You should be the one to do that," Dr. Smith said gently. "But she might need time." Galvin hesitated. He wasn't afraid of Gwen's reaction. Not really. He was afraid of what she had endured while he lived in the illusion that his life was fine. He had been asleep. This woman, this fierce, quiet woman, had carried a child alone, worked herself to exhaustion, stayed silent when she could have spoken, saved him, and then disappeared. Her silence had not been weakness. It had been mercy. "I want to name him," Galvin said suddenly. Dr. Smith didn't respond, letting the moment hang in the air. "I don't want him to feel like a question mark his whole life." Galvin added, "I think Gwen will want to be part of that decision," the doctor finally said, with a faint smile. Galvin nodded again. His gaze didn't leave the window. Hours passed. The hospital moved around him. A wedding ring clinked on a water dispenser. Someone wheeled in a cart of surgical supplies. A child cried 2 halls away. None of it reached Galvin in any meaningful way. He existed in a thin bubble between time and responsibility where nothing made sense except the sight of that child rising and falling with each small breath. A nurse came to escort him to Gwen's room. He paused outside the door. For the first time since that night by the roadside, Galvin hesitated. Inside, Gwen lay against the pillows, one hand across her midsection, the other resting loosely at her side. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, staring out the narrow window toward a slice of late afternoon sky. When the door opened and he stepped in, she didn't startle. She simply turned her face slowly toward him and looked. "I thought you'd be at your engagement party," she said. Her voice was dry, brittle. He didn't respond to that immediately. He stepped closer, but stopped halfway to her bed. "I left," he said. A pause. "I know," she replied. "They told me." Silence again. "I saw him," Galvin said softly. "He's perfect." Gwen's throat moved as she swallowed, her eyes glistening, but refusing to blink. "I had the test run. I know it's not how it should have happened, but he's mine." Her lip trembled, but she clenched her jaw to stop it. "I didn't want your money," she whispered. "I know. I didn't want pity. I never thought you did. I didn't even want this." She gestured vaguely toward the room, toward herself, toward him. "I just wanted to survive it, without being erased." Galvin walked to the side of the bed and sat in the visitor's chair. "You saved my life, not just that night. You made me wake up. You made me see how blind I was to the world that let me succeed while others drowned." Gwen's hand curled slightly at the edges of the blanket. "I was invisible to your world until I showed up in your driveway," she said. "You were never invisible," Galvin said, voice thick. "I just hadn't learned how to see." She blinked, then tears breaking past her restraint. "I didn't want you to feel obligated," she whispered. "That's why I left. That's why I wrote that damn letter." "I don't feel obligated," Galvin said. "I feel like I've been walking in a fog for years. This hymn, you cut through all of it." Their eyes locked. "I want to be there," he said. "Not because of guilt, because I love him, because I respect you, because this is my family, and I won't run from it." A breath left her lips. Not quite relief. Something smaller, something more fragile. "You haven't even held him yet," she said. Galvin smiled, small and broken. "Then let's fix that." Back in the nursery under dimmed lights and soft monitors, Gwen sat in a recliner while Galvin cradled the child gently in his arms. The baby's fingers curled around one of his knuckles with surprising strength. Galvin watched, transfixed. Gwen watched him watching. For a moment, there was no past and no future, just breath, skin warmth, and that delicate, terrifying thing that humans chase all their lives, connection. "He has your nose," Galvin said. Gwen laughed, a weak but real sound. "And your mouth," she countered. The baby shifted, let out a small cry, then settled again. "I don't know how to do this," Galvin admitted. "Neither do I," Gwen replied, "but I guess that's why they call it learning." Galvin looked at her. "Can we start over?" She didn't answer right away, but after a long moment she reached out and touched his hand, just a tap, just enough to say, "Maybe." And that was enough. For now. Because the truth had a face, and its name was Hope. The hallway of Westford Memorial felt colder than usual, though the thermostat likely hadn't changed. The floors gleamed with their usual sterile shine, the walls still humming faintly with the quiet rhythm of machines and soft footsteps. But to Adelia Matthews, everything felt different. She wasn't walking in as the matriarch of the Matthews name, as the power behind a rising empire, or the woman who had built entire networks out of manners and precision. Today she was simply a mother. And perhaps, for the first time in years, she felt entirely, utterly human. She paused at the double-pane glass just outside the neonatal unit. Her gloved hands trembled slightly, though she refused to acknowledge it. Through the glass, row upon row of tiny beings lay swaddled in their little nests of light and warmth. Some kicked, others slept. Her gaze scanned slowly until it landed on a bassinet tagged Baby Stone. The nurse attending nearby gave a polite nod, unaware that the woman watching from the other side was one thread away from unraveling. The child's face, soft pink, untouched by the world, held nothing accusatory. But those eyes, they were unmistakable. Wide-set, deep-hued, with a curious little crease above the brow that only appeared when the child squirmed or sighed in his sleep. Adelia had seen those eyes before, every day. In the mirror when Galvin was a child, in photographs she used to keep by her nightstand, in memories that until this moment had never pierced her like a blade. Her heels clicked faintly as she stepped back, lips parting, but no sound came. Inside her chest, something collapsed, a long-held belief. A fortress of expectation, a mother's script handed down for generations. We protect the name. We don't open doors that weren't meant for us. We don't owe anyone outside this family. She had said those words, lived by them, weaponized them. And in doing so, she had turned her back on a woman who had shown more courage than most in their circle ever would. The sharpness of guilt was unexpected. It wasn't just that Gwen had saved her son's life. It wasn't just that the child now carried Galvin's blood. It was that Gwen had done it all save protected, carried the burden while being judged, dismissed, and cast aside by her. She didn't remember the walk to Gwen's room. She must have passed nurses, visitors, doctors, maybe even Galvin himself, but the journey dissolved into a blur of silent reckoning. When she arrived, the door was ajar. The room was dim, the curtain drawn partially. Gwen sat by the window, one hand resting gently on her stomach, the other cradling a small blanket. She looked exhausted, but alert. She looked like someone who had made peace with being alone. Adelia stood there unable to speak for what felt like too long. Gwen noticed her. Their eyes met. No anger in Gwen's, only fatigue, and something Adelia hadn't expected: dignity. "Mrs. Matthews?" Gwen said, her voice even polite, tired. Adelia tried to reply. Her throat tightened. She took a breath. "I didn't know how to begin," she said, finally stepping in. Gwen gave a short nod but didn't offer a seat. It wasn't rudeness. It was control. She had every right. "I saw him," Adelia continued. "The baby. He looks just like Galvin did when he was born." Silence filled the space again, but it wasn't hostile. It was dense, heavy with all the things not said. "I said things to you," Adelia admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Things that no woman deserves to hear, especially not from another woman, especially not from a mother." Gwen still didn't speak. Her hand tightened slightly on the blanket. Her jaw tensed. "I raised Galvin to be strong, focused. I thought I was protecting him by shaping him into someone who never allowed mistakes, who never let emotion cloud his duty. But what I did, what I've done, I didn't raise a man. I tried to manufacture perfection." Adelia stepped closer. Her breathing was uneven now. She didn't know what response she expected. Maybe none. "That child, he is a Matthews. I know it now. Not because of a test, not because of what anyone told me, but because when I saw his face, I saw everything I tried to erase from my son, the parts that feel that love, that make him real." The words cracked her voice. It sounded strange breaking in public. She had practiced control for decades, but there it was. "I was cruel to you, Gwen. I used power to push you away. I thought if I made you disappear, I could make the problem disappear. But you were never the problem. I was." Still, Gwen didn't speak, but she didn't turn away either. That meant something. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I may not deserve it, but I'm here because I had to say it. I was wrong. About you. About who I thought was worthy. About everything." The room stood still. A baby's cry echoed faintly down the hallway, then faded. Gwen's eyes blinked slowly. Then she spoke. "You tried to buy my silence." "I know," Adelia said quietly, "and that might be the thing I regret most. Because when someone is brave enough to tell the truth, we should never try to pay them to forget it." Gwen looked down. Her shoulders softened just slightly. "I'm tired," she said, "of always having to be the one who holds it all together, of being the one who gets judged for surviving." Adelia's eyes welled. "You shouldn't have had to. Not alone." A long pause. Then Gwen said, "He has your son's eyes. But he'll grow up seeing the world differently." Adelia nodded. "Then I hope I live long enough to see that world, and maybe even help it happen." She finally moved closer and gently placed a small envelope on the nightstand. "It's not money, just a photograph of Galvin when he was born. I thought, maybe you'd like to see the resemblance." Gwen looked at it, then up at her. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection. Adelia turned to leave, her coat clutched tightly in her arms now. But as she reached the door, Gwen's voice stopped her. "You said you didn't come here for forgiveness. What did you come for?" Adelia turned slowly. "I came because I needed you to know I see you now. Not as a mistake, not as an outsider, but as the mother of my grandson, and the woman who saved my son's life. I came because I needed to stop lying to myself. No more words were needed." The door clicked shut behind her and she walked down the hallway, not as a Matthews, not as society's polished matron, but simply as a woman finally brave enough to be honest. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the small hospital room, painting quiet golden stripes across Gwen's bed. Her baby lay nestled beside her, wrapped in a soft blanket, breathing peacefully. She sat upright, eyes staring out the window, as if searching for answers in the motionless sky. After everything, after the pain, the betrayal, the resilience she had thought this would be the part where peace finally settled in. But peace didn't come that easily. Not for a woman like her. Not in a world like this. Victoria appeared in the doorway, holding a bouquet of fresh lilies and a warm expression on her face. "Morning," she greeted gently, stepping inside. "How are you feeling?" Gwen gave a small, tired smile. "Like I gave birth to a revolution." Victoria chuckled softly, placing the flowers on the side table. Then, after a moment of silence, she cleared her throat and reached into her handbag. "I came to ask something on Galvin's behalf," she said. "He's holding a press event tomorrow, launching a foundation in your name. He'd like you there, as his guest, and not just that." Gwen looked over slowly, her brow furrowed. "Why me?" "Because you're the reason it all started," Victoria replied, "and because he wants the world to see what he sees." There was a long pause. Gwen's eyes dropped to her baby, then to her own hands resting in her lap. "He doesn't owe me anything. He doesn't have to." "It's not about debt," Gwen Victoria interrupted softly. "It's about truth." The next day, the Matthews Foundation's press conference filled the grand ballroom of the Harborview Hotel. Journalists, photographers, influencers, and corporate heads filled every seat, murmuring and speculating. On stage, a long table draped in navy silk bore the family crest and a centerpiece of pristine white roses. This was the kind of event reserved for titans, the kind of audience that fed off reputation and spectacle. Gwen arrived through a side entrance, dressed modestly in a pale blue dress. Victoria walked with her discreetly shielding her from curious eyes. Her baby, cared for by a nurse in a quiet room nearby, was safe. Galvin had not yet appeared. His absence sparked whispers. When Gwen was invited onto the stage to receive a symbolic award for inspiration and courage, she hesitated. She had always been the invisible one, the woman who held back in doorways, who lowered her gaze to avoid judgment. Now a spotlight burned against her skin. She walked slowly, every step heavy with the burden of what she had endured and what she was about to face. A reporter's voice cut through the quiet just as she reached center stage. "Isn't she the woman who made Mr. Matthews cancel his engagement?" The room stilled. Eyes turned, cameras focused, and a low murmur swelled like rising thunder. Gwen stood frozen, heart pounding. The spotlight felt like fire now. She turned, half ready to leave. Then came the footsteps. Galvin entered through the main aisle, calm but deliberate, dressed in a navy suit that matched the tablecloth. He didn't walk with the guarded posture of a CEO, but with the resolve of a man who had made peace with his truth. He climbed the stage and took the microphone. His voice was steady, not loud, but clear enough to silence the room. "She didn't ruin my life," he said. "She saved it. Twice." He turned to Gwen, his eyes unflinching. "This woman found me when I was unconscious and alone. She carried me out of the street, called for help when no one else would. Then months later, she gave me a son I never knew I had. A child born of a night neither of us fully remembered, but a night that changed everything." People leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. "I grew up being told love has rules. It must look a certain way, come from a certain background, follow a lineage. But I have learned painfully and humbly that truth does not come wrapped in tradition. It comes sometimes through chaos, through collision, through someone who challenges everything you were taught to believe." He walked toward Gwen slowly. "She is the mother of my child, the woman who stood by me even when I didn't deserve it, the one who never asked for a spotlight yet carried the weight of my name's shadow." Gwen's lips parted, but no words came. Galvin turned to the crowd again. "I won't continue pretending that silence is protection. It's cowardice. So today, in front of everyone who ever doubted her, I'm going to say what I should have said long ago." He knelt, pulled out a small velvet box, opened it. "Gwen Stone, will you marry me?" Gwen's throat tightened. The crowd vanished from her mind. Only him. Only this moment. She had been invisible too long. She had been made to feel like a mistake, a burden, a cautionary tale. But here he was, unshaken, asking her to be more than a story, to be his future. She swallowed. Tears lined her eyes. Then she whispered, audible enough for the microphone, strong enough for the world. "Yes." The room erupted. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Applause rose and broke across the hall like a crashing tide. Somewhere in the back, Adelia Matthews watched her face, unreadable, but her hands clapping. Later, as they stood together backstage, Galvin touched Gwen's cheek and leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "From now on," he said quietly, "no more hiding." And she nodded, smiling through her tears, because finally, she wasn't a secret. She was the ending and the beginning of a story that the world was finally ready to hear. And so, in a world that often draws lines between who deserves love and who doesn't, one woman's courage and one man's awakening became a quiet revolution. Not loud, not easy, but real. This wasn't just a story of love. It was a story of dignity, of second chances, of what it means to stand in the storm and still choose kindness. If you stayed with us till now, thank you truly. Stories like this don't end when the screen fades to black. They live on in questions and hearts, in the quiet reckoning we carry into our own lives. What would you do in Adelia's shoes? Have you ever been Gwen, unseen, underestimated, and yet unbreakable? Or Galvin, standing at a crossroad, unsure which truth to follow? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, share your moment of truth. And if this story moved something in you even just a little, stay with us. Because in the next chapter, justice won't just knock. It will walk in.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.